Welcome back, everybody. This is only partly a Malazan video. So 2 days ago, 3 days ago, Counselor of Moonspawn made an amazing video essay on vulnerability and weakness in characters in fantasy. I'll link it below. You all should go and watch it if you haven't already. It's really good. And it got me thinking, and then I figured I'll not write a long essay in her comments because I didn't feel like it. I just, ramble a bit on the topic. Now, obviously, her video is much better than mine because she knows how to actually write out an essay and then rate it, so it's well formulated and everything. I'll, more freeform ramble about parts of that. I'll probably not get into the gender question. Maybe we'll see. I don't always feel comfortable talking about like gender issues in fantasy books because obviously I'm a dude, and yeah, I don't know. We'll see where this goes. There's enough other stuff that I feel comfortable talking about, so let's do that. Cheers. All right. So, the basic thing where I'm going to start off of is that Counselor pointed out that we very rarely see actual vulnerability, or the way vulnerability and weakness are treated within fantasy books is oftentimes not exactly the way we like it actually manifests in the world outside. We have like all these strong, snappy, and so forth characters who survive everything the world throws at them and keep on going. And the question of why that is the case and why it is so rarely that we see actual weakness, vulnerability, and so forth in fantasy characters. That's sort of roughly the thing, but as I said, go watch that video. She pulled out one character in particular, that is Sandang Lokta, whom I have a lot of problems with, and I feel like so there's two things that I came up with like whilst thinking about it. On the one hand, there is something where I will try to explain why I think it is that type of character that we see within a lot of fantasy stories. And then I'll look at why that is actually a problem. So let's look at the first. Why do we have like heroes in fantasy stories? Why don't we often have like actually people that are too scared to do stuff and so forth? As Counselor puts it so well. Well, the basic answer is that fantasy literature, by and large, is still a very, very limited field. It if you look at it, it kind of evolves out of like two or three different things, which one of them is pulp fantasy of the 1930s, 1920s. There is the other route that is mythology through Tolkien and so forth. And yeah, there's actual mythology and legends as well. But what it boils down to is that fantasy literature, by and large, obviously there's other parts, is still adventure fiction, right? So while it is true, or I believe it is true, that you can tell every possible story within a fantasy world if you want to and choose to, that's not what happens most of the time. Most of the time we resort to, in fantasy, and I guess it's similar, although maybe not as extreme in science fiction, but in fantasy it is by and large we still tell adventure stories. And this is like, I mean, when you look at it in mythology, in adventure fiction, in all of these sources that, or inspirations for fantasy literature, these are stories about people that go out there and do stuff. Now, we have changed a bit in that we don't look at like these more heroic characters anymore, but that's only one half of it. The other part is that the story structure is still mostly go out there, solve conflicts by violence. That's mostly what it is. Like Frodo not wanting to actually do the get rid of the ring is probably one of the most reluctant heroes you find in a lot of fantasy literature still, and he still goes out and does it because he has to. Well, that is just because, like, when you look at the pulp part of it, those were adventure short stories. They were just at some point set no longer in our real world, but were moved to fantastic realms by people like Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard and so forth. But those were short stories sold in magazines. There had to be action in there. You don't get like a very, reluctant hero. Well, you get some reluctant heroes, but you still get heroes. They still solve their problems through action and mostly violence. And when you look at mythology, that's very mostly the same things. Like you don't have Siegfried deciding not to kill the dragon because he's afraid. He doesn't do that. He kills the dragon because, frankly, he's pretty dumb as a person. And once again, like, problems are mostly solved by violence, maybe sometimes at least a bit by trickery, but it's still, those are very active people, very active heroes, very active characters that, for the most part, decide to bring some change and do stuff. Those are the models. The next one is obviously for modern fantasy, adventure gaming, tabletop role-playing games of the 70s and 80s. And those were mostly marketed to kids, or adolescents, more likely. And at least for a long time, towards mostly male adolescents. And if you get like a bunch of like 12 to 15-year-old boys to play a game together, for the longest time, they will not play introspective, scared people, because they are probably, a lot of them are introverts and are maybe scared of the world outside, which is normal when you're 12 to 15, because the world outside is pretty, complex and can be scary. So in your game, you obviously act out something else. You act out your like power fantasies. You go out and do all the stuff you're not allowed or too scared to do in real life. That's why in almost all of those old school pen and paper role-playing game sessions of kids, young boys, like every single time the party enters a bar, they all start hitting on the serving maids, because 15-year-old boys are mostly too scared to do that in real life. That's also why you go and fight dragons and do stuff. It's built into the game, because it is a game. It's built into the game to have action-filled adventures, to do shit out there in the world. And that's fine for a game. Playing an introspective character who doesn't do anything because he's too scared of the world and has all these terrible wounds in his soul is not something that, is an entirely different game. Is it possible to write such a game? I believe it is. I'm pretty sure there are some nowadays in the more like story-based tabletop gaming area that are exactly about such things. But those are games that are marketed to an adult player group already. And those are not the kind of games that had an impact on modern day fantasy literature. No, that's adventure stories that were done by the pulps, fantasy that was built up as like, or inspired by mythology, which is mostly, male dominated. Well, that's a different part that I didn't want to talk about today. But it's also action-based, violent conflict resolution all the time. Maybe a heist here and there where people actually use their brains instead of just their fists to solve problems. But for that kind of thing, you need active characters. You need characters that are willing to actually go out there and do such things. And since a large part of modern day fantasy literature is still built on that model, not all of it, but a large part, that means we only get that kind of character. And while we have, and this is sort of the next step from this, our taste in characters has slightly changed, right? We don't want the pure heroes anymore because grimdark is the new thing and flawed characters and shit like that. But they're not really flawed. I mean, yes, they are, and this is sort of where we're gonna come to in a minute or so. They are flawed now. Because we aim for realism in a way, which is dumb because this is still fiction. But the point is, at some point we realized that your Conans, and even Conan was slightly flawed, and your characters in your Lord of the Rings and so forth didn't feel like people. Well, they weren't meant to feel like people. Aragorn is not a realistic human being. That was never the point, because we are still talking about something that is inspired by mythology. Characters in mythology are ideal beings up to a point. They're not supposed to be your everyday dude. That's not their point. That's why you have that almost clear delineation between good and evil, or you have at least the poles of good and evil, even though some of the characters, oscillate between those. You have definitions of good and evil because that's sort of the function that mythology has. It's supposed to help us understand human nature and help us understand or find models of which we could, try to strive after in our life. So those are ideals. Now, that is something that over time has changed in literature in general. And we have, through stuff like television, modern day television, modern day movies, and so forth, we have come to that point where we expect realism. When you look at how, when you go back and look at how television has changed, or movies have changed from being theater, basically film theater shows, into something more and more realistic, up to a point where you don't stylize things that much, you don't overact and so forth. You go for the more and more realistic. That's just a trend that we have in all these arts over the last century, I would say, roughly, because the technological progress made it easier, more and more easy to actually portray things realistically. I'm not saying that, CGI is realistic, but it makes it much easier to approach the realistic image of what a fireball would look like, or what magic would look like, than, the technology we had in the 1930s and 1940s. When you look at, I don't know, something like Wizard of Oz, those special effects are far away from realism. And that made, also helped the trend towards more realistic characters. So we want characters that have flaws, that are, damaged in a way, because, the fact is that living in the world that we live in, most of us will be damaged in some way or other, because we are not ideal heroes living in a mythology most of the time. We are damaged people. We realize that most people have fears, are scared, have scars from their past, and so forth, because the universe isn't really fair. So we want that in our fantasy characters as well, so they are more relatable up to a point. That led to that whole, I don't know, movement from, say, apart from earlier examples, especially in mainstream fantasy from, say, the 1990s onwards, because when you look at all the D&D fantasy stuff that people like Salvatore wrote in the beginning, at least, those are still pretty black and white characters, to put it mildly. Me hating Salvatore is a whole nother story that I'm not sure I want to do videos on, because holy shit. Anyway, point is, we're starting with, at least in popularity, with someone like George R. R. Martin, and then someone like Joe Abercrombie showing up afterwards and so forth. We have all these characters that bring a lot of trauma with them. It's something that we obviously found in literary fiction far earlier. We also found it in parts of science fiction already a couple of decades earlier, because science fiction is its own beast. And it started in fantasy. Now we hit a problem. The problem is that despite all their flaws, these characters still need to be able to function within an action-packed adventure story. They can be crippled like Santa and Glockter. They can be like broken and broken and broken again. But at the end of the day, they still need to go out there and have adventures, because that's apparently the modus operandi most of fantasy readers and writers think in. And that leads to that weird disparity that Council of Moonspawn noticed, that a lot of these characters, while having something of a soft core, emotional core with all those flaws in there and all those wounds in there, they still have that hard shell exterior, that snappiness, that satire, that irony, that biting wit, and all of that stuff that we give people to camouflage their inner wounds, in a way, because they need to have that, because otherwise they wouldn't function within an adventure story, which our fantasy book still is. And now we come to the point where we see like 2 or 3 different things, and I'll try to make it structurally work what I'm trying to tell here. On the one hand, we have a lot more characters that don't do such things in parts of literature that are not modeled after the adventure story, the quest, whether you want to call it a quest or not, but it's like the adventure story of going out there, solving conflicts by violence. We always joke, at least I always joke, about serious, mostly English literary fiction being all about sad, middle-aged white people getting divorced and crying over it. That, of course, is a joke. But within that type of serious literary fiction, I'm using serious here like with, not really in a way, I mean, every kind of literature can be serious, but like with like your pseudo-realistic literary fiction, you have the room to explore these characters that have taken wounds, are vulnerable and weak, because that mode for that kind of story, whether it is a short story or an entire novel, is no longer the quest and adventure story. Those people don't need to go out there and have adventures. No, they can stay inside and just wilt away because the world out there is harsh, uncaring, and brutal to them, and they don't have the power, energy, bravery, whatever, to face all of that. You can have such characters in literary fiction because those stories are not bound by the quest and adventure model that most fantasy still is built upon. So on the one hand, when we get such characters within fantasy, it is with fantasy stories, fantasy books, authors that deliberately or because of their background work outside those just basic like adventure models. We have such characters within the Malazan book or the Fallen, for example. This is obviously spoilery, but for example, you have characters like Felicin, obviously. You have a character like the Maibi in Memories of Ice, who is all the time, who is retreating all the time. She doesn't have any other option and choice, right? She doesn't have any of these options. But those are plot lines that run against what we expect from fantasy. When you look at like audience response to that, a lot of readers hate those characters and those plot lines for all kinds of reasons. And one of those reasons, I submit, apart from general misogyny, which also plays a role there, we'll probably come back at that at a different point. But, apart from that, is also that it is a plot line, a story, a character arc that we don't expect in fantasy. We don't expect fantasy characters to, like, hide, cry, and wither away, whether they want to or not. Because they have no other choice, which makes us uncomfortable to read. Makes it uncomfortable to read that kind of story for us, because it's jarring compared to what we expect when we start reading a fantasy story. So on the one hand, we have that in some fantasy stories. It's getting more, luckily, because people from other backgrounds are entering the fantasy field. But it'll still take a while because, that escapist adventure story, it's also a very it's just very entertaining. It's fun to read. Escapism is something that we need in our lives, so there is that. And this brings me to my other big issue here that I realized when I was watching and listening to Counselor from Moonspawn, and that is the passivity of a lot of these flawed heroes in fantasy. And this kind of comes back partly to what I already criticized about Grimdark in general, but the point is, when you look at a lot of these characters, and I'll stick with Abercrombie here for a moment, because it's so obvious. There's these characters, and you have a lot of these characters that have taken a lot of scars and a lot of wounds over the years, and that are sort of, and this is my problem, they're passive characters. Sandan Glacta is a passive character. Giselda and Luther is obviously a passive character. Logan Ninefingers is an even more passive character. That's like my issue when I read that book. It's like that catchphrase of Logan's, you have to be realistic about these things. That's the biggest issue there. Because the problem that we have with such flawed characters that got hit and hit and hit and hit by the universe, and then go out and act and do their heroic thing, or semi-heroic thing, or abhorrent thing in the case of Sandan Glacta. Let's not forget the guy is a torturer. But the point is, they do that because they are forced by the universe. And this is the big change from your heroes. It's sort of, they very rarely make active choices to do what they are doing. They are all forced by the universe, and their maximum goal is to survive within the current society, within their current system. They're not changing anything. And this, in the end, is where I see a societal problem for our world outside of the books. Because it is part of our cult of individualism, which is connected to, our worldview that has been formed by capitalism and a lot of other things these days. Like that we are expected to take the hits of the universe without grumbling, because life ain't fair, so what? Keep on doing, keep on going. And we have accepted that. We are not... the most we aim for is to survive within the system, to survive within that whole mess of the universe, to not complain too loudly, to put a brave face on and just keep on going. And people like that will never change the system. Yes, the universe ain't fair. Life ain't fair. That's a fact. But that does not mean we can't complain about it. We have every single fucking right to rail at the universe for not being fair, to call out the unfairness of the universe, because if we don't, we will never start changing it. We will never actually aim for a better world. Is the world unfair? Yes. Could it be fairer? Hell yeah. Of course it can. And just shutting up, pushing on through, and being realistic about things won't change a single thing. And that's the problem that we have with a lot of these snarky, ironic, broken characters in a lot of current fantasy. They never aim to do anything. They don't act on their own. They act because the universe kicks them and kicks them and kicks them until they get off their ass to do something. And then the maximum they do is not change the universe. The maximum they do is try to survive, because you have to be realistic about these things. And that makes me fucking angry, because if those are the heroes we read about, I'd rather read about someone who actually decides to do something, to change the system, to not accept the way the world is. And that's the kind of books we need. And that's the kind of books we don't get with just these characters. All right, that's it for today. Not for today. I'll come back later on with a Malazan video. That's sort of my first half of my thoughts on what Chancellor of Moonspawn said. I might have more thoughts on the matter. I also have some thoughts on the aspect of how we portray female characters within fantasy. But I'm not quite sure yet if I want to put all of those out, because once again, I'm a dude, and a dude talking about how to do female characters feels a bit, I don't know, not right to me. But if you really want me to talk about that as well, then maybe I'll do it in a couple of days. Anyway, I hope you got something out of this. I hope you have ideas of your own, comments of your own. I'd love to continue that discussion that Counselor started. And yeah, I don't know, like, subscribe, and whatever. And I'll talk to you later. Until then, cheers.